The golden hour was a liar. It dripped honey over rusted steel and made broken glass glitter like diamonds. Fiona Ross lived for that lie. She moved through the skeletal remains of a Detroit factory, her boots crunching on debris, her camera a steady weight in her hands. This feeling, this razor's edge between beauty and danger, was the only thing that made her feel truly alive. It was also the thing that would probably kill her one day. She lifted the viewfinder to her eye, framing a perfect shot of sunlight bleeding through a collapsed roof. Stability was a nice idea, a warm bed and a predictable morning, but the pull of the ruin was stronger. The click of the shutter was the only sound. Then it wasn't. A muffled shout cut through the quiet, followed by the angry screech of tires on gravel. It came from the alley just beyond the factory wall. Common sense screamed at her to pack up, to run, to disappear back into the city. But common sense was a boring, quiet voice, and Fiona's curiosity was a roar. She lowered her camera, her heart thumping a dangerous rhythm against her ribs, and crept toward a busted-out window for a better look. She saw it in flashes. A sleek black car cornered by a larger, battered sedan. Men spilling out, their movements tight and violent. A glint of metal. It was an ambush, brutal and fast. She shouldn't be watching this. She raised her camera instinctively, a terrible habit, just as a burst of motion exploded from the group. Someone was thrown hard against a dumpster, and a heavy pipe clattered onto the pavement, skipping once, twice, before flying sideways. Fiona didn't even have time to gasp before it slammed into the crumbling brick wall right beside her head. The impact sent a shockwave through the structure. Dust and mortar rained down. She stumbled backward, her feet tangling in loose wiring on the floor. Her world tilted sideways, a sickening lurch of motion followed by a sharp, white-hot crack in her ankle. She fell hard, her head striking a forgotten chunk of concrete with a dull, wet thud. Darkness swarmed the edges of her vision. The shouts in the alley faded into a distant ringing in her ears. Pain was everywhere, a screaming chorus from her ankle and a throbbing drumbeat in her skull. She pushed herself up, her hands scraping against the rough floor. Her camera lay beside her. She reached for it, her fingers closing around the familiar shape, only to feel the sharp edges of a shattered lens and the slick, warm wetness of her own blood. She had to get out. She had to get help. Staggering to her feet, she put weight on her left foot and cried out as fire shot up her leg. Leaning against the wall, she looked wildly through the gaping factory entrance. The world was a blur of gray decay, but through the haze of pain, she saw one thing. A single point of light in the deepening twilight. It came from a massive, imposing mansion that stood like a fortress in a sea of ruin, its windows glowing with the soft, flickering light of candles. Between her and the house stood a tall, wrought-iron gate, chained and locked. It was her only chance. Sobbing from the pain, Fiona stumbled toward it, dragging her useless foot behind her. She clutched her bloodied camera to her chest, leaving a dark, desperate trail on the ground as she lurched toward the light. Her bloody fingers slipped on the cold iron of the gate, and she collapsed against it with a sob. The world was a spinning, dark mess of pain. She was done. She closed her eyes, ready for the darkness to take her completely. Instead, the gate swung inward with a low, heavy groan. Fiona forced her eyes open. A man stood there, a silhouette against the warm light of the mansion's entrance. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit that seemed absurd in this wasteland of urban decay. He wasn't rushing to help. He was watching her. As her vision swam back into focus, she saw his face. Sharp jaw, dark hair, eyes that held no alarm, no pity. They weren't kind. They weren't cruel. They were assessing. He looked at the blood on her face, the ruined camera clutched in her hand, and the unnatural angle of her ankle without a flicker of shock. It was as if a bleeding, broken woman appearing at his gate was a perfectly normal Tuesday evening. A protest died in her throat as he moved, stepping over the threshold and into the night. Before she could process it, he was lifting her into his arms. The movement was so swift, and sure it stole her breath. One arm scooped under her knees, the other supported her back, and suddenly she was off the ground, held against a chest that felt as solid as stone. He carried her inside as if she weighed nothing at all. The world shifted from the cold, metallic scent of the dying city to the smell of dark wood, old leather, and something clean, like polish. The chaos outside was replaced by an absolute, unnerving silence inside. He carried her through a grand foyer and into a vast, book-lined study, placing her gently on a deep leather sofa. He disappeared for a moment, and returned with a medical kit. Kneeling before her, he began to tend to her wounds with a practiced efficiency that sent a shiver of fear through her. His touch was firm, impersonal, but strangely gentle as he cleaned the gash on her forehead and expertly wrapped her throbbing ankle. He worked in silence, his focus absolute. The fog in her head began to clear, replaced by a sharp, urgent need to understand. To leave. Thank you, she managed, her voice raspy. She pushed herself up, wincing as her ankle protested. I need to go. I should get to a hospital. He finished tying off the bandage and looked up at her. His gaze was direct, unwavering. That won't be possible. Fiona stared at him, confused. What? Why not? You've been very kind, but I have to go. The men who did this to you are still out there, he said, his voice low and final. You are not safe. A chill that had nothing to do with her injuries snaked down her spine. The way he said it, it wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a warning. It was a statement of fact, an edict delivered from a throne she hadn't realized she was in the presence of. I'll take my chances, she said, her voice shaking but defiant. She tried to stand. He didn't move to stop her, but his eyes pinned her in place. No, he said, the single word carrying the weight of an iron door slamming shut. You won't. And somewhere in the echoing silence of the grand house, Fiona heard the distinct, heavy sound of a bolt sliding into place. Fiona woke up to the impossible softness of silk sheets against her skin. For a dizzying second, she thought she was dreaming. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old books, a scent so calming it felt like a lie. She opened her eyes. A canopy of dark, carved wood loomed above her. The room was vast, decorated in deep blues and heavy mahogany, with moonlight filtering through tall, curtained windows. This wasn't a hospital. She pushed herself up, her head throbbing a dull, steady rhythm. Her ankle, however, was a different story. The makeshift bandage was gone, replaced by a professional wrap, tight and supportive. The searing pain had subsided into a manageable ache. She was wearing a soft, silk pajama set that was definitely not hers. A quiet rustle of fabric from the corner of the room made her freeze. He was there. Sitting in a leather armchair as if he'd been there for hours, watching her sleep. Matthew. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were alert, fixed on her with an unnerving intensity. In the dim light, he looked less like a rescuer and more like a collector admiring his newest acquisition. You're awake, he stated, his voice a low rumble that filled the silent room. The doctor said you might have a mild concussion. He gave you something for the pain. A doctor? Fiona's own voice was a dry rasp. You brought a doctor here? Of course, he said, as if the alternative was unthinkable. I told you. You're safe here. The word safe felt like a cage. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her good foot finding the plush rug. I want to go home. He didn't move from his chair. This is your home, for now. You have the run of the house. Eat what you like, read what you like. But you cannot leave the grounds. The sheer audacity of it stole her breath. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but anger was a fire licking at its edges. You can't be serious. You can't just keep me here. I can, he replied, his tone infuriatingly calm. And I will. She stood, putting a little weight on her injured ankle and hissing as pain shot up her leg. She didn't care. She would not show him weakness. Who are you? By what right do you think you can do this? For the first time, a flicker of something new crossed his face. Not anger, but a deep, consuming interest. He was fascinated by her defiance. It was the look of a man who was used to people crumbling before him. She wasn't crumbling. "The right of the man who found you bleeding at his gate," he said, finally rising from his chair. He was even taller than she remembered, an imposing shadow that seemed to shrink the enormous room. "The right of the man who is keeping you from being found by the people who put you in this condition." "My condition is your fault," she shot back, her voice rising. "That fight, that ambush, that was your world spilling into mine." He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze unwavering. "Exactly. And now you're in my world completely. The only way to protect you is to control where you are." Her bag sat on a chest at the foot of the bed. Her things. Her identity. Ignoring him, she limped over and grabbed it, clutching the worn leather strap like a lifeline. He watched her every move, his silence a heavy blanket. He gestured to the door. "My housekeeper has prepared food for you. I'll be in my study if you need anything." He turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. The sound of the lock clicking wasn't loud, but in the silence it was a gunshot. She was a prisoner. Her hands shook as she unzipped her bag. She pulled out her shattered camera, the blood on it now dried to a dark brown. Useless. Then, her fingers brushed against familiar, worn leather. Her journal. She pulled it out, her one private space in a world that had suddenly become his. It was her anchor, the only thing here that was truly hers. She opened it to a fresh page, her mind racing. She wouldn't just document this. She would plan. She would find a way out. This house had walls, but so did she. And hers were stronger. The command came not from him, but from his silent, gray-haired housekeeper. "Mr. Jensen expects you for dinner at 8. It was delivered as a simple fact, leaving no room for refusal. Fiona's first instinct was to lock herself in the bedroom, to refuse to play this twisted game. But hiding would grant her nothing. If she was going to understand the man who held her captive, she had to face him. She had to watch him, learn him, and find the crack in his armor. She found him waiting in a dining room so vast it could have hosted a royal banquet. A long, polished mahogany table stretched between them, set for only two. He sat at one end, she at the other, the distance between them a chasm of silent tension. Candlelight flickered, making the shadows dance. The entire scene was designed to intimidate, to showcase his power and her isolation within it. "I hope the food is to your liking," he said, his voice carrying easily across the ridiculous distance. Fiona picked at the perfectly cooked salmon on her plate. It tasted like ash. "It's fine." He watched her, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. He wasn't eating, just observing her, cataloging her every reaction. "I had a business partner once," he said suddenly, his voice dropping into a conversational tone that was somehow more menacing than a command. "We built everything from the ground up. I trusted him with my life." Fiona looked up, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. She said nothing, knowing this was a performance, for her benefit. "He sold me out," Matthew continued, his eyes dark and unreadable in the candlelight. "Not for a rival, not for a fortune. He did it for a woman who promised him an easy life away from all this. He traded loyalty for a fantasy." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I learned a valuable lesson that day. Control is the only thing you can trust. Everything else, loyalty, love, freedom, it's all negotiable. People will always let you down." A cold dread settled in Fiona's stomach. This wasn't just a story. It was a justification. It was the reason she was here, a piece of his world he could control completely. She saw the betrayal that had hardened him, the wound that had festered into this obsessive need for power. It didn't make her feel sorry for him. It made her feel terrified. After the meal, she stood to leave, the silence stretching taut between them. Her ankle throbbed in protest. As she turned toward the hallway, he was suddenly there, moving with a predator's silent grace. "You're limping more than you were this morning," he observed, his voice stripped of its earlier hardness. For a fleeting moment, he sounded genuinely concerned. He gestured to a small, private library they were passing. "There are books in there. Anything you could want to read. It might help pass the time." The kindness was a slap in the face. A gift offered inside a prison. It was a reminder that he controlled her pain, her comfort, and her boredom. "I'm fine," she said, her voice tight, and pushed past him into the hall. She walked down the long, shadowed corridor, her footsteps muffled by a thick Persian runner. Halfway down, her own movement caught her eye. She stopped, staring at a massive, ornate mirror that hung on the wall. A deep, violent crack ran from the top corner to the bottom, fracturing the silvered glass like a frozen lightning bolt. Fiona looked at her reflection. She saw a stranger wearing someone else's clothes, her face pale and drawn in the dim light. But the crack in the glass cut right through her image, splitting her into pieces. One piece was the defiant woman who challenged a Mafia boss. Another was the terrified prisoner, counting the minutes. Another was the broken photographer, mourning her shattered camera. Her sense of self was splintering, distorted by his possessive gaze. He wasn't just holding her body captive, he was breaking her spirit apart, piece by jagged piece. The next 2 days were a blur of methodical exploration. Fiona pushed past the pain in her ankle, using it as fuel. She was no longer a victim waiting for an opportunity, she was a hunter looking for a weakness. She limped through the silent, opulent halls, her photographer's eye now cataloging exits, not aesthetics. Every door was solid oak, every lock a heavy, modern mechanism. She ran her hand along the edge of a towering window in the music room, its glass thick and unyielding, feeling the cold, hard truth of it. It was reinforced. Bulletproof, probably. At the end of one long corridor, a man stood in a dark suit, his hands clasped behind his back. He wasn't looking at her, but she felt his awareness of her like a physical weight. He didn't move. He didn't have to. He was a human wall, a silent declaration that this was not a home, but a headquarters. A fortress. The scale of it all began to crush her. This wasn't just some rich recluse playing games. This was real power, the kind that built walls and bought men to guard them. She found herself in his study, the same room where he had first tended to her wounds. It felt like a lifetime ago. A massive map of Detroit covered one wall, dotted with small, colored pins. It was a war map. She was standing in the command center of a king, and she was his most recent, and most unwilling, acquisition. "Looking for something?" His voice came from directly behind her. Fiona jumped, her heart slamming against her ribs. She hadn't heard him enter. He moved with a frightening silence that defied his size. She turned to face him, forcing her expression to remain neutral. "A way out," she said, her voice steady. There was no point in lying. He took a step closer, invading her space, forcing her to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. He smelled of expensive cologne and something darker, something like iron and resolve. "There isn't one. There's always a way out. Not from me," he said, his voice dropping to a low, possessive murmur. He looked past her, at the map, then back to her, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her skin prickle. "The world outside is dangerous. My world is dangerous." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, from her bandaged ankle to the defiant spark in her eyes. "But in here, with me, you are the safest person in this city. Stay." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was a command disguised as a choice, an iron fist wrapped in velvet. "Stay and be my prized possession. Stay and be my beautiful, caged bird." The air crackled with the weight of his declaration. He expected her to be grateful. He expected her to be broken enough to accept. But the sight of the reinforced windows, the silent guard, the warm map on his wall, it hadn't broken her. It had forged her fear into steel. She looked him straight in the eye, her chin lifted. All the fear, all the pain, all the fury of the last few days coalesced into a single, sharp point of clarity. She would not trade one cage for another, no matter how gilded its bars were. "Safety that costs me my freedom," she said, her voice ringing with cold, absolute certainty in the quiet study, "is just a better-looking prison." The air went still. The calm mask he wore cracked, not with explosive anger, but with something far more terrifying. His jaw tightened, and his eyes darkened until they were black pits of thwarted will. He had offered her his world, his protection, and she had thrown it back in his face. He wasn't just angry. She saw it then, in the obsessive fire that ignited in his gaze. He was more determined than ever to keep her. He was a collector who had just discovered his favorite piece had a soul of its own, and he would stop at nothing to possess it completely. The silence that followed her defiance was worse than any argument. It was a cold, heavy thing that settled over the mansion, smothering everything. Matthew didn't confine her to her room or punish her. He simply withdrew. The intense, obsessive focus he had fixed on her was now gone, replaced by a chilling absence. The house became a tomb, and she was its loneliest ghost. She spent most of her time in the grand library, a place so vast and quiet she could almost forget she was a prisoner. She was limping past his study, the door left carelessly ajar, when she heard his voice. It was not the low, controlled rumble he used with her. This voice was stripped of all pretense. It was sharp, cold, and lethal. "They left a mess," he said, his words clipped. "Victor's getting desperate." This wasn't a clean hit, it was a statement. Fiona froze, pressing herself against the cool wood of the hallway wall. Her breath caught in her chest. Victor. The name landed like a stone in the pit of her stomach. The abstract danger he used to justify her imprisonment, the faceless men in the alley, they now had a name. There was a pause on the other end of the line, then Matthew spoke again, his voice dropping even lower, laced with venom. "Find out who they missed. I want every loose end tied. Victor thinks he can bleed me out on my own territory? I'm going to burn his entire operation to the ground." The finality in his tone sent a shiver down her spine. This wasn't a business rivalry. This was war. And she had stumbled right onto the battlefield. The click of the phone being hung up was her cue to move. She scurried back to the library, her heart hammering against her ribs. He wasn't just a powerful man. He was a Mafia boss. The thought, which had been a suspicion before, was now a terrifying certainty. Over the next few hours, the atmosphere in the house shifted from tense silence to humming, barely contained violence. Sleek black cars crunched up the gravel driveway, depositing more men in dark suits. They moved with a quiet, deadly purpose, their eyes constantly scanning the grounds. The silent guard at the end of the hall was now too. The housekeeper's movements became brisk and anxious. The fortress was preparing for a siege. Fiona watched from a window as Matthew strode across the lawn, flanked by two of his men. He was no longer the calculating captor who debated philosophy in a candlelit dining room. He was a commander, pointing and giving orders, his entire posture radiating a brutal authority. He was distracted, his mind consumed by this unseen enemy. And for the first time, Fiona understood the terrifying truth of her situation. She wasn't the center of his world. She was a complication. A piece on a chessboard he hadn't accounted for, now tucked away for safekeeping while he fought a much larger, deadlier game. His obsession with her was real, but it was a luxury. His war with Victor was a necessity. The danger he'd warned her about wasn't a lie to keep her locked up. It was his reality. And by stumbling into that alley, by bleeding on his gate, she had made it her reality, too. The threat was no longer an abstract concept. It had a name, a purpose, and it was coming for the man who held her captive. Her cage suddenly felt less like a prison and more like the only thing standing between her and a man named Victor. The chaos was her chance. With Matthew consumed by his war, a frantic energy had replaced the mansion's usual oppressive calm. Guards moved with new urgency, their attention turned outward, toward the threat named Victor. Fiona saw it in a brief, beautiful flicker of opportunity. A guard, usually posted by a rear service entrance, was called away by a sharp command from the front of the house. He left his post without a second thought. The door was unguarded. Adrenaline washed away the ache in her ankle. This was it. Now or never. She moved, her limp a frantic, clumsy rhythm against the polished marble floors. Her heart was a wild bird beating against her ribs. Every shadow seemed to reach for her. Every creak of the old house was a shout of alarm. She reached the door, her hand trembling as she turned the knob. It was unlocked. The cold night air was a shock, a glorious slap in the face. It tasted of freedom. She slipped out into a manicured garden, the darkness a welcome cloak. Staying in the shadows of the tall hedges, she made her way toward the massive front gate. The main lock was a fortress, but a smaller pedestrian gate set into the stone wall was secured with a simple bolt. In the rush to fortify the grounds, someone had overlooked it. Her fingers, slick with nervous sweat, fumbled with the cold metal. It slid back with a groan that sounded as loud as a gunshot. She was out. Fiona didn't run. She forced herself into a fast, hobbling walk down the deserted street, away from the mansion's suffocating glow. The factory district was a maze of skeletal buildings and broken pavement, but tonight it looked like paradise. The pain in her ankle was a roaring fire, but she ignored it. Freedom was just ahead. A main road, a car, a bus, anything to get her away from him. Then she heard it. The low, guttural rumble of an engine. It wasn't one of Matthew's silent, luxury cars. This was something older, angrier. It turned the corner behind her, its headlights cutting through the darkness, pinning her like a frightened animal. She ducked behind the rusted shell of a burned-out truck, her breath catching in her throat. The car slowed, crawling past her hiding spot. It kept going. Relief washed over her, so potent it made her dizzy. She waited a beat, then another, before stepping back out onto the street. The car was waiting for her 50 feet ahead, engine idling. Her blood ran cold. Before she could retreat, another vehicle, a battered sedan, screeched around the opposite corner, boxing her in. 2 men spilled out of the first car. They weren't clean-cut and disciplined like Matthew's guards. These men were rough, their movements predatory. Well, one of them sneered, a grin splitting his face. Look what we found. Victor's going to be very happy to meet the boss's new pet. Fear, absolute and paralyzing, seized her. She had escaped the gilded cage only to run straight into the jaws of the wolves. This was a death sentence. She backed away, her good leg hitting the wall of a dead-end alley. Trapped. Just as they lunged for her, a third sound ripped through the night, the high-pitched scream of performance tires. One of Matthew's black sedans materialized out of the darkness, sliding to a perfect, violent stop that blocked the alley entrance. The doors flew open. His men moved like ghosts, a blur of dark suits and brutal efficiency. There were no shouts, only the sickening, wet thud of fists meeting flesh and a single, choked-off groan. It was over in seconds. Victor's men were on the ground, unconscious or worse. The passenger door of the sedan opened. Matthew emerged, stepping into the dim light. He wasn't looking at the men his soldiers had just dispatched. His eyes, burning with a cold, possessive fury, were locked on her. He walked toward her, his face a mask of stone. The terror she felt from Victor's men was nothing compared to the dread that now flooded her veins. He didn't speak. He simply grabbed her arm, his grip like iron, and pulled her from the alley. She was too stunned, too terrified to resist. He all but threw her into the back of his car, slamming the door shut behind her. The silence inside the vehicle was absolute, a suffocating void. Fiona stared out the window, her body trembling, watching the ruins of Detroit flash by. She had fought for her freedom, and all she had done was prove him right. She had proven that the only thing more dangerous than being his prisoner was not being his prisoner. His voice, when it finally came, was dangerously quiet, each word a perfectly weighted stone dropped into the silence. "I told you," he said, not even looking at her. "The only safe place is with me." He didn't speak a word on the drive back. He didn't speak as he pulled her from the car and marched her through a side entrance of the mansion, his grip a bruising band around her arm. The silence was a living thing, a cold, suffocating presence that was far more terrifying than any shouting could have been. He led her up a grand staircase and down the hall, stopping only when they reached the door to her suite. He opened it, pushing her gently but firmly inside. Fiona stumbled, catching herself on the edge of the bed. She turned, a defiant protest already forming on her lips, but he was already closing the door. He didn't look at her. He didn't say a word. The only sound was the sharp, final click of the lock. And then, nothing. She was alone. Utterly and completely alone. For the first hour, she paced like a caged animal, the adrenaline from the alley still coursing through her. She rattled the doorknob, knowing it was useless. She stared out the reinforced windows at the moonlit grounds, now patrolled by twice as many silent guards. The luxury of the room, the silk sheets, the plush rugs, the fresh flowers on the nightstand, was a mockery. It was the most beautiful prison cell in the world. Victor's man had called her the boss's new pet. The words echoed in her mind, a brand seared into her identity. That's all she was. A possession. A complication. Meals appeared outside her door on a tray, delivered by the silent housekeeper who refused to meet her eyes. The house was quieter than ever, but it was a tense, agitated silence. Late that first night, she heard heavy, restless footsteps in the hall outside her room. Pacing back and forth. Matthew. The knowledge that he was just outside, as unsettled by her confinement as she was, offered no comfort. It only amplified the suffocating sense of his control. He was agitated because his favorite toy was out of his sight. By the second day, the frantic energy had burned itself out, leaving behind the cold, hard ash of reality. She sat on the window seat, staring out at nothing, and let the truth settle over her. He was right. She had walked out of his gate, and straight into the jaws of his enemies. She would have been taken, or killed, if he hadn't intervened. But that was the poison in his protection. The danger existed only because of him. It was his world, his war, his rival. She wasn't a random victim of a chaotic city, she was a target specifically because he had claimed her. She was a pawn in a game she didn't even know the rules to. Her anger, which had been a hot, blinding fire, began to cool. It solidified into something else, something sharper and more useful. Cold resolve. Trying to run was stupid. It was like a mouse trying to outrun the hawk that can see the entire field from above. She couldn't escape his world by running. She had to navigate it. She needed a new strategy. Not just escape. She needed power. Leverage. Something he wanted, something he needed, that only she could provide. To do that, she had to stop fighting him like a cornered animal, and start watching him like a predator. The lock on the door clicked open with a suddenness that made her jump. 48 hours. Exactly. Matthew stood in the doorway. He looked tired, his jaw tight with strain, but his eyes were as intense as ever. He was expecting to see her broken. Defeated. Ready to accept the terms of her gilded cage. He saw something else entirely. Fiona met his gaze, her own eyes clear and steady. The terror was still there, a cold stone in her stomach, but it was buried deep. On the surface, she was calm. Composed. Her anger was no longer a wild blaze but a controlled, hidden flame. She had walked into this room a victim. She was walking out a strategist. Her quiet compliance was a weapon he didn't see coming. When Matthew unlocked the door, Fiona walked out without a single word of protest. She ate the food the housekeeper brought her. She sat in the library and turned the pages of a book, her eyes scanning the words without truly reading them. She was a model prisoner. And it was driving him insane. He watched her from a distance, his brow furrowed, trying to understand the shift. He expected tears, or rage, or pleading. He did not expect this unnerving, watchful stillness. She had stopped fighting the bars of her cage and had started studying the zookeeper instead. Her photographer's eye, the skills she had honed in the ruins of the city, had a new subject. Before, she looked for the way light fell on broken concrete, for the story in a forgotten, rusted machine. Now, she looked for the subtle shift in a guard's posture when a certain car pulled up the driveway. She saw the way Matthew's most trusted lieutenant, a hard-faced man named Leo, always touched the left side of his jacket, checking for a weapon, when he brought bad news. She noticed that deliveries from a specific, unmarked van always arrived on Tuesdays and Thursdays, just before dawn. These weren't random details. They were a composition. She was no longer just seeing the house, she was seeing the hidden structure beneath it, the invisible lines of power and routine that held it all together. One afternoon, she walked past his study. The door was slightly ajar, and she heard the low murmur of voices. She didn't stop, didn't even slow her pace, but for 3 seconds she had a perfect, unobstructed view. It was a snapshot. Matthew stood behind his desk, the king on his throne. Leo stood to his right, listening intently. Another man, broader and more menacing, stood before the desk, his head slightly bowed. He was receiving orders. In that single glance, she saw the hierarchy as clearly as if it were a diagram. Matthew gave the command, Leo managed the strategy, and the other man, the enforcer, carried it out. That night, she sat on the floor of her room, her back against the locked door. She opened her leather-bound journal. The pages were no longer filled with frantic, emotional scribbles about her captivity. They were neat, precise, and cold. Under a new heading, Operations, she drew a simple flowchart. Matthew's name was at the top, circled. An arrow pointed to Leo, Logistics/Strategy, and another to Marco, Enforcer. She wrote down the times of the guard rotations she had memorized. She sketched the layout of the ground floor from memory, marking the service entrance she'd used to escape with a small, angry X. She was a ghost in his house, a silent observer he thought he had broken. But a photographer was never just a passive viewer. A photographer hunted for the perfect angle, for the moment when the subject's true nature was exposed. She was hunting now, gathering her weapons one quiet observation at a time. The fear was still a constant companion, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was fuel. She closed the journal, the worn leather cool beneath her fingers. He thought he had trapped a flighty, reckless artist. He had no idea he was living with a hunter who was patiently learning the scent of her prey. The game had changed. She was no longer just trying to survive his world, she was mapping it, so she could one day burn it to the ground to light her way out. The attack happened just after midnight. Fiona didn't see it, but she felt its aftershocks ripple through the house. The low rumble of cars returning too fast, the crunch of tires on gravel that sounded like grinding teeth. She heard tense, clipped voices in the foyer, the name Victor spoken like a curse. From her window, she saw one of Matthew's men, Marco, the enforcer, being helped from a car, his arm wrapped in a blood-soaked makeshift bandage. A cold dread coiled in her stomach. His war was getting closer. She retreated to the library, the one room that felt vast enough to contain her anxiety. She sank into a leather armchair, pulling her knees to her chest, her journal lying unopened on the table beside her. Her careful observations and diagrams felt childish now, like a game played while a real war raged just outside the gates. An hour later, the door opened. It was Matthew. He looked like he had been dragged through hell. His suit jacket was gone, his white shirt was rumpled, and the top 2 buttons were undone. A thin, angry scratch ran down his jawline, beaded with a single drop of dried blood. He held a glass of amber liquid, and the faint smell of whiskey preceded him into the room. His usual mask of cold control was gone, replaced by a raw, bone-deep exhaustion. He stopped when he saw her, his posture faltering for a fraction of a second. His eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, were shadowed with something she couldn't name. He looked at her, curled up in the massive chair, and the quiet fear she tried so hard to hide must have been plain on her face. It was the same fear she'd felt in the alley, the same fear she'd felt when she woke up in this house. His expression tightened. He walked over to the fireplace, staring into the cold, dark hearth. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken violence. "Marco will be fine," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Victor's men were waiting for him." "It was a message." Fiona said nothing. This was his world, his bloody messages. He took a slow drink from his glass, the ice clinking softly. He didn't turn to look at her, but she knew his next words were aimed directly at her heart. "The ambush in the factory district, The day you were hurt. He paused, his knuckles white around the glass. It wasn't random. They weren't after you. Fiona's blood ran cold. She slowly uncurled her legs, her bare feet pressing against the cool floor. They were waiting for me, he said, the words stark and ugly in the quiet room. My car was due to pass that alley 10 minutes after you fell. You stumbled into a kill zone meant for me. He finally turned, his gaze meeting hers. The exhaustion in his eyes was eclipsed by a wave of raw, suffocating guilt. You getting hurt, the ankle, your head, all of it, that's on me. The world stopped. The carefully constructed narrative of her captivity, the story of a benevolent monster protecting her from a dangerous world, shattered into a million pieces. It was a lie. All of it. He wasn't her protector. He was the storm. He was the reason the lightning had struck. Every act of his twisted care replayed in her mind, now tainted with this new, terrible truth. The doctor he'd called, the soft bed, the meals he insisted she eat, it wasn't obsession. It was penance. He was tending to a wound he had inflicted. He had caged her not to keep her safe from the world, but to hide his own catastrophic mistake. A strange, dizzying mix of emotions washed over her. There was fury, so cold and pure it burned. The audacity of him, to play the savior while being the villain of her story all along. But beneath the anger was a flicker of something else. A strange, hollow pity. She saw the truth of him then, a man so trapped by his own guilt that his only solution was to build a cage around its living embodiment. He took a step toward her, as if to explain more, but she held up a hand. A small, simple gesture that stopped him cold. The power in the room had shifted. It was a silent, seismic event, and they both felt it. She was no longer just the captive. He was no longer just the captor. He was the man in her debt, a debt paid in blood and freedom that he could never hope to repay. The moral high ground was hers, a fortress far more impenetrable than his mansion. She looked at him, her eyes clear of fear for the first time. She didn't need to run. She didn't need to fight. He had just handed her the weapon she needed to win. The guilt was a chain he had forged himself, and now he wore it. Fiona saw it in the way he avoided her gaze, in the tense line of his shoulders when they passed in the hall. The power hadn't just shifted, it had inverted. He had confessed his sin, and in doing so, had handed her the weapon she'd been searching for. Now she just had to learn how to fire it. She needed to test its weight, its accuracy. An all-out demand for freedom would be a misfire. He was still the man with the guards and the locked gates. She needed to prove her value, to show him that her mind was more useful to him than her body was as a prisoner. The opportunity came 2 days later. It was a Thursday, one of the days she had noted in her journal for the unmarked van delivery. She was in the library when Leo, his trusted lieutenant, walked past the open doors, speaking in a low, urgent voice into his phone. Fiona didn't even look up from her book, but her ears strained to catch the words. Same route as last week, Leo was saying. The shipment has to get through. Victor won't be bold enough to try something on the North Bridge in broad daylight. Fiona's blood went cold. The North Bridge. She remembered a snippet of conversation she'd overheard between 2 guards the day before, something about Victor's crew being spotted near the old cannery district, which was less than a mile from the south side of that very bridge. They had dismissed it as nothing, but it was a piece of the puzzle. Leo thought Victor wouldn't be bold. But Matthew had said it himself, Victor was getting desperate. Desperate men were always bold. This was it. Her test. She found Matthew in his study, staring at the war map on his wall. He looked up as she entered, his expression wary. The air between them was thick with his unspoken guilt. I was in the library, she began, her voice carefully neutral, as if she were commenting on the weather. Your man, Leo, walked by on the phone. The walls in this house are thinner than they look. Matthew's eyes narrowed. The wary look was gone, replaced by the sharp, assessing glint of the Mafia boss. And what, exactly, did you overhear? She met his gaze without flinching. He mentioned a shipment, the North Bridge, and how Victor wouldn't dare. She let the words hang in the air for a moment before adding the final, crucial piece. It's just. I heard some of your guards talking yesterday. About Victor's men being seen near the cannery. It's probably nothing. It wasn't a warning. It was a carefully constructed observation, offered with a shrug of indifference that cost her every ounce of self-control. She was giving him the pieces and letting him connect them, letting him think it was his conclusion. He stared at her, his mind clearly racing. Suspicion warred with the cold, hard logic of her words. He knew she was no fool. He knew this wasn't an accident. But the risk of ignoring her, of dismissing her and being wrong, was too great. Marco's blood was barely dry. Without a word, he turned and grabbed the phone on his desk, barking a single word into it. Leo. Fiona didn't wait for the rest. She turned and walked out of the study, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had fired her shot. Now she had to wait and see if it hit its mark. Less than 10 minutes later, the house erupted in quiet, controlled chaos. Men moved quickly, cars started, and Leo's voice could be heard snapping orders. They were changing the route. Later that night, Matthew found her by the cracked mirror in the hallway. He stopped a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. There was a welcoming party waiting at the North Bridge, he said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but his eyes told a different story. The suspicion was gone, replaced by a grudging, unnerving respect. You were right. He saw her then, truly saw her, not as a reckless photographer or a beautiful object of his guilt, but as something else. Something intelligent. Something dangerous. I'm moving you to the master suite in the East Wing, he said. It has a balcony. A walled garden. You'll have access to it. Fiona's breath hitched. It wasn't freedom, not even close. It was a larger, more beautiful cage. But it was a concession. A reward. A calculated risk on his part, an acknowledgement of her new status. She was no longer just his captive. She was his unlikely, unwilling ally. Thank you, she said, her voice a quiet whisper. They both knew it wasn't gratitude. It was an acceptance of the new terms. The game had just become infinitely more complex, and infinitely more deadly. The balcony was a beautiful lie. It offered a view of a walled garden, fragrant with night-blooming jasmine, and a sliver of the bruised purple sky over Detroit. It was more space, more air, but Fiona knew the truth. A larger cage was still a cage. The trust she had earned was not a key, but a longer chain. She stood in the cool night air, listening, always listening. His voice drifted up from the stone patio directly below her. He was on the phone with Leo, his tone low and clipped. He had become careless with his secrets around her, a fatal miscalculation. He thought her a useful analyst, a strange pet who had proven her worth. He had no idea she was a saboteur. He's agreed to the terms, Matthew said, his voice a low growl of triumph. A final meeting. He thinks he's setting a trap for me. Fiona held her breath, her fingers gripping the cold iron of the railing. The old Jefferson Access Tunnel. Midnight tomorrow, Matthew continued. Just him and his inner circle. He wants to end this, face to face. I'll bring our entire force. We'll seal both ends of the tunnel and wipe him from the map for good. The Jefferson Tunnel. The words echoed in the silent corners of her mind. This was it. The final piece. The location, the time, the entirety of his plan lay bare. Her heart didn't pound with fear. It beat with the cold, clear chime of opportunity. This was her only chance, the one she had been gathering weapons for. The next evening, she found him in his study. He stood before the war map, a general planning his victory. He looked up as she entered, a flicker of something almost like warmth in his eyes. He thought she was his ally. It's too simple, she said, her voice quiet but firm. He raised an eyebrow. What is Victor's plan? She said, walking closer until she stood beside him, her eyes on the map. She forced herself to breathe, to keep her voice steady. Everything you've told me about him, everything I've seen, he's a cornered animal. But he isn't stupid. He knows you'll bring your whole army to that tunnel. That's the point, Matthew said, a hint of condescending pride in his tone. He'll be outmanned and outgunned. No, Fiona said, shaking her head. You're thinking like a commander. Think like him. He knows he can't win a straight fight. The meeting isn't the trap, Matthew. The meeting is the bait. She looked up at him, her gaze direct and intense. He's expecting your army. He will have a plan for them. But he won't have a plan for you. Suspicion clouded his features, but she saw the seed of her idea take root. It played directly to his ego, to his belief that he was the untouchable center of his own universe. He'll be watching the entrances for your men, for a convoy of black cars. She pressed on, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He'll be so focused on the army he expects that he won't be looking for a single man walking in ahead of them. You want to surprise him? You want to truly end this? Go in first. Alone. See the trap before it's sprung. Your men can follow 5 minutes later, once you give the signal. He was silent for a long time, his eyes scanning her face, searching for the angle, the trick. But he found nothing but cold, hard logic. She was offering him the one thing he couldn't resist, the chance to be the hero of his own story, to outsmart his rival with a move of singular, arrogant brilliance. He'll be looking for a king with an army, she said, her final words a perfectly aimed arrow. He won't be looking for just the king. A slow, dangerous smile touched Matthew's lips. She watched him take her idea and claim it as his own, turning it over in his mind and finding it flawless. You're right, he said, his voice filled with a newfound, chilling admiration. He'll never see it coming. Fiona gave a small nod, her insides turning to ice and fire. He thought he was preparing for his victory. He had no idea he was walking into hers. She had just set the board for the final game, manipulating the master manipulator into a checkmate he couldn't yet see. And tomorrow, at midnight, she would be the one waiting for him in the echoing darkness of the tunnel. The air in the Jefferson tunnel was cold and dead, smelling of damp concrete and rust. Water dripped from the ceiling in a slow, maddening rhythm, each drop echoing in the oppressive silence. A single string of bare, caged bulbs cast long, distorted shadows that danced like ghosts. This was a place between places, a forgotten artery beneath the city, and tonight, it was Fiona's battlefield. She stood in the center of the tunnel, a lone figure in the dim light, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket. The throbbing in her ankle was a dull, distant memory. She wasn't the injured victim anymore. She was the trap. She heard his footsteps long before she saw him, the confident, measured sound of his expensive shoes on the gritty floor. They echoed, growing louder, closer. He expected to find an empty tunnel, a stage for his final victory over Victor. He did not expect to find her. Matthew stopped dead when he saw her. He was a dark silhouette against the tunnel's mouth, his body instantly tensing. For a second, he thought Victor had somehow gotten to her, that this was an enemy's trick. But then he saw her face in the pale yellow light. She was perfectly calm. In control. Fiona? His voice was a sharp, confused bark. What the hell are you doing here? Get back to the car. Now. No, she said. Her own voice didn't waver. It carried in the enclosed space, clear and steady. We need to talk. We can talk after I've handled my business. He took a step toward her, his expression hardening into a mask of cold fury. He was angry at the breach in his security, at her inexplicable presence in the most dangerous place she could possibly be. This is your business, she said, and the certainty in her tone stopped him cold. Your business with Victor. He stared at her, the pieces not fitting together in his mind. How do you know about this? I know everything, Fiona stated, the words simple and absolute. She saw the flicker of disbelief in his eyes, the dawning suspicion. I know you plan to seal both ends of this tunnel. I know you're expecting Victor and his inner circle to walk right into your army. She took a step toward him, closing the distance, and the power dynamic shifted with it. She was no longer retreating. I also know that Victor isn't coming. The silence that followed was broken only by the steady drip, drip, drip of water. He's not stupid, Matthew, she continued, her voice laced with a pity that was more insulting than any anger. He knew you'd bring everyone. The meeting was never the trap. It was the bait. To get you, and every man you have, down here in a hole in the ground. He looked at her, his mind racing, searching for the lie, the angle. He found none. He found only the cold, terrifying logic he had failed to see himself. While you're down here waiting for a ghost, she said, her voice dropping, each word a hammer blow, his real force is on its way to your house. The one you left behind with a skeleton crew, so you could bring your army here. Understanding crashed over him, a physical, sickening wave. The house. His center of operations. His fortress. Left vulnerable. You think you've been protecting me, she said, her voice echoing in the tunnel, wrapping around them both. But you've been so obsessed with keeping me locked in your world that you've gone blind. Your greatest strength, your control, became your greatest weakness. He used your obsession against you. And he was right. He stood there, the master manipulator, the king of a violent empire, utterly outmaneuvered. Not by his rival, but by the woman he had caged. She wasn't his pet. She wasn't his project. She was the strategist who had seen the flaw in his design, the one that was about to cost him everything. He was cornered not by guns and knives, but by the devastating truth in her eyes. The arrogance drained from his face, replaced by the stark, gray look of a man watching his empire crumble. He took a half-step back, the movement involuntary, his mind catching up to the disaster she had just laid at his feet. His world, which had seemed so solid and impenetrable, was a house of cards, and she had just shown him the breeze that was about to knock it all down. How? He breathed, the word a raw whisper of disbelief. It wasn't a question about her knowledge. It was a question about his own blindness. Fiona didn't give him a moment to recover. This was her ground, her moment, and she would not surrender it. There's more, she said, her voice cutting through the damp air. I know his real target. It isn't just your house. It's the server room in the basement. The one that holds all your financial records, every transaction, every account. He isn't just trying to kill you, Matthew. He's trying to erase you. He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw. She had him. That was the detail that proved her knowledge was absolute. It was the heart of his operation, a secret he guarded more closely than his own life. She saw the war in his eyes. The possessive monster who had caged her was battling the pragmatic leader who needed to survive. For a terrifying second, she saw the monster winning, a flash of pure, possessive rage that said he would rather burn with his kingdom than let her go. I will give you the information that will save your life and destroy Victor, she said, her voice ringing with the cold clarity of a bell. She was not pleading. She was not negotiating from a place of weakness. This was a transaction between equals. I'll tell you the exact time his men will move. I'll tell you the weakness in their approach. Everything you need to turn his trap back on him. She let the offer hang in the air, a lifeline she was dangling just out of his reach. He stared at her, the woman he had found bleeding at his gate, the woman he had dressed and fed and locked away like a precious doll. That woman was gone. In her place stood a queen with a dagger to his throat. In exchange, she said, her voice dropping, each word a condition, a change she was forging for him. You will open the gates and you will let me walk away. The possessive fury returned to his eyes, a dark, burning fire. No. The word was a gunshot in the echoing tunnel, an absolute refusal from a man who was not used to being denied anything. But Fiona didn't flinch. She had expected it. She had prepared for it. Then you lose, she stated simply. You lose it all. Your house, your money, your power. You'll be fighting a war on two fronts, and he will bleed you dry. Is keeping me worth that? Is one woman in a cage worth the price of your entire world? This was his choice. His obsession versus his empire. His control over her versus his control over everything else. She watched him grapple with the impossible equation. She saw the moment he finally understood. The fierce independence he found so fascinating in her, the fire he had tried to capture and keep for himself, it was never something he could own. It was a weapon, and she had just aimed it directly at his heart. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she knew he wasn't seeing his captive anymore. He was seeing the woman who had outplayed him. "You will never contact me again," she added, her final term, the most important one. It was not enough to be free. She had to be forgotten. "You will erase me from your life just as you planned to erase Victor from the map. My freedom for your life. That's the deal." The tunnel was silent save for the dripping water, each drop a tick of the clock counting down to his ruin or her release. He was cornered, not by an enemy with a gun, but by the consequences of his own actions. To save himself, he had to lose the one thing he was obsessed with keeping. After a lifetime packed into a few seconds of crushing silence, he gave a single, sharp nod. The nod was almost imperceptible, a sharp, downward jerk of his chin. But in the echoing silence of the tunnel, it was a surrender. A treaty signed in the space between one dripping drop of water and the next. Fiona's heart, which had been a cold, steady drum, gave a single, painful thud. She had won. She didn't let the relief show on her face. It was too soon. The deal wasn't done until she was on the other side of his gate. "Victor's men aren't storming the front," she said, her voice as flat and hard as the concrete floor. "They're using the old service tunnels that connect to the wine cellar. 2 of them. They'll be inside before your perimeter guards even know what's happening. They move in 20 minutes. Matthew absorbed the information without a flicker of emotion, his mind already recalibrating, shifting from his own failed plan to the new one she had just handed him. He was a general again, processing battlefield intelligence. He turned without a word and strode back toward the mouth of the tunnel, pulling his phone from his pocket. Fiona followed, keeping a careful distance. She heard him snap orders, his voice a low, lethal weapon. He spoke in codes and clipped commands, and she could feel the entire weight of his empire shifting, turning on its axis to face the true threat. He ended the call and slid the phone back into his pocket, his movements economical and precise. He never looked at her. The drive back to the mansion was a suffocating void of silence. Fiona stared straight ahead, out the windshield, watching the skeletal factories and broken streets of his territory give way to the manicured perfection of his estate. She didn't dare look at him. She could feel his presence beside her like a physical heat, a storm of thwarted will and raw fury held in check by a promise made under duress. The grip of his hands on the steering wheel was the only sign of the war raging inside him, his knuckles bone-white. He didn't pull up to the grand front entrance. He drove the car right up to the massive, chain-locked gates she had collapsed against what felt like a lifetime ago. He killed the engine. The sudden silence was even heavier than before. For a moment, either of them moved. Fiona's breath was a tight knot in her chest. This was the final test. He could change his mind. He could lock the doors and her victory would mean nothing. But then he opened his door and got out. He walked around the front of the car, his tall frame blocking the moonlight, and opened her door for her. It was a gesture of cold, final courtesy. She slid out, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. The night air was cool on her skin, thick with the scent of jasmine from his perfect prison garden. He didn't send a guard. He didn't bark an order. He walked beside her to the pedestrian gate set in the stone wall, his footsteps a heavy, rhythmic crunch on the gravel, a stark contrast to her own lighter, quicker pace. She was moving toward freedom. He was walking to his defeat. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single, heavy key. He slid it into the lock. The sound of the metal grinding, of the tumblers falling into place, was the loudest thing Fiona had ever heard. The bolt slid back with a deep, metallic groan. He pushed the gate inward, holding it open for her. This was it. The unlocked door. The open cage. She could feel his eyes on her, a burning, possessive gaze that tried to hold her, to brand her one last time. She knew if she looked at him, she might falter. She might see the man who had tended to her wounds, the man who had confessed his guilt, and not just the monster who had taken her life from her. She couldn't afford to see that. Fiona looked straight ahead, through the opening, at the dark, empty road that led back to her own life. She took a step, then another, crossing the threshold from his world back into hers. She didn't run. She walked, her back straight, her head held high. She did not look back. Behind her, the heavy iron gate swung shut. It closed not with a clang, but with a soft, final click, the sound of a book being closed on a dark and terrible story. 6 months. Sometimes it felt like a lifetime ago, a dark fairy tale that had happened to someone else. Other times, she would wake up in the dead of night, the phantom feeling of a locked door making her heart hammer against her ribs. But tonight there were no locks. The gallery was bright, loud, and full of life. It smelled of wine and expensive perfume, a world away from the scent of old leather and his chilling cologne. People laughed and chatted, their voices a warm, welcome noise that filled every corner. On the clean white walls hung her soul. Her exhibition was called Freedom. Each photograph was a piece of her ordeal, translated into light and shadow. A sliver of sun cutting through the bars of a rusted grate. A single, perfect white rose caught in a tangle of thorny, dark vines. The fractured reflection of a woman's eye in a shard of broken mirror. No one here knew the literal truth behind the images, but they felt the emotion. They felt the desperate claw toward the light. Fiona, they're incredible. Her friend, Sarah, squeezed her arm, her eyes shining. So raw. So powerful. Where did the inspiration even come from? Fiona smiled, a real, easy smile that reached her eyes. Let's just say I spent some time feeling stuck. I needed to photograph my way out. It was the best answer she could give. The truest one. She was thanking a critic for his glowing review when the feeling hit her. It was a sudden, absolute drop in the room's temperature, a silence that fell only on her. A prickle of awareness crawled up the back of her neck. It was a feeling she had spent 6 months trying to forget. The feeling of being watched. By him. Her smile froze on her lips. The critic's voice faded into a meaningless buzz. Slowly she turned, her eyes scanning the crowded room. She searched the smiling faces, the clusters of people sipping wine, and found nothing. For a second, she thought she had imagined it, a ghost haunting the biggest night of her life. And then she saw him. He stood in the shadows near the back of the gallery, partially obscured by a support pillar, a ghost made of flesh and blood. He was dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored suit, a specter of wealth and power in her world of art and freedom. He wasn't looking at the photographs. His gaze was fixed on her, an unwavering, intense stare that cut through the crowd and pinned her in place. Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her stomach. A primal instinct screamed at her to run, to hide. He had broken his promise. He was here. But as she stared back, the fear began to recede, replaced by something else. He wasn't moving toward her. He made no sign of approaching. He was just watching. There was no menace in his posture, no hint of the possessive fury she knew so well. His face was a blank mask, but his eyes held the haunted look of a man observing a world he could never be a part of. He was watching her live the life she had fought him for. He was a king visiting the ruins of a kingdom he had willingly surrendered. Their eyes met across the room. The noise and the people between them melted away. For a single, breathless second, it was just the two of them, locked in a silent, final acknowledgement. He saw the strong, healed woman she had become. She saw the man who had kept his word, a man paying a silent, lonely penance. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He turned, melting back into the shadows he had emerged from, and was gone. Fiona let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The warmth of the gallery rushed back in, the sound of laughter and conversation suddenly loud in her ears. "Fi! You okay?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowed with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Fiona looked at the empty space where he had stood. Then she turned her gaze to her photographs, to the images of broken chains and shafts of light. She had seen a ghost. And he was gone. She was finally, truly, free. "I'm fine," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I've never been better." If you enjoyed the video, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel to keep up with our content.